The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado, California. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck, watching his SEAL trainees run through their morning drills. 28 years in the Navy had taught him to read men quickly, and today something felt different. A civilian truck had arrived at dawn, carrying a single passenger who now sat quietly in the shade of the equipment shed. The man looked ordinary enough, maybe 45 years old, wearing simple civilian clothes, faded jeans, work boots, and a plain gray t-shirt. No military bearing that Morrison could detect. No visible patches, insignia, or anything that marked him as someone special. Yet something about him made Morrison uneasy. The way he sat perfectly still, watching everything while seeming to watch nothing. His eyes moved constantly, cataloging details, measuring distances, noting positions. "Commander Morrison?" The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen from Naval Special Warfare Command. She climbed the steps to the observation deck, a manila folder in her hands. "We need to talk." Morrison turned from watching his men. "Colonel, what brings you to my training center this early?" Chen glanced toward the civilian by the equipment shed. "That man down there. He's your new marksmanship instructor." "My new what?" Morrison's voice carried 28 years of military skepticism. "Colonel, with respect, I've got the best shooting instructors in the Navy. Master Chief Kowalski has been training SEAL snipers for 15 years. My men don't need some civilian contractor coming in here playing soldier." "This isn't a request, Commander." Chen's tone was firm, but not unkind. "This comes from the Pentagon. That man will be training your advanced marksmanship classes for the next 6 months." Morrison took the folder from her hands and flipped it open. The single page inside contained almost no information. A name, Michael Gray, an ID number, and security clearance codes that made Morrison's eyebrows rise. The clearance levels were higher than his own. "Colonel, this file tells me nothing. Where did this guy come from? What's his background? What makes the Pentagon think some civilian can train Navy SEALs?" Chen's expression was carefully neutral. "That's all the information you're getting, Commander. Your orders are to give Mr. Gray full access to your training facilities and complete cooperation from your staff." Morrison closed the folder and looked back down at the man in the shade. As if sensing the attention, the civilian looked up and made eye contact. For a moment, Morrison felt like he was looking into the eyes of a predator, calm, patient, absolutely lethal. Then the man nodded slightly and looked away. "When does he start?" Morrison asked. "Now." An hour later, Morrison gathered his advanced marksmanship class in the main briefing room. 12 of his best shooters sat in metal chairs, looking skeptical and slightly annoyed. These men were the elite of the elite, SEALs who had proven themselves in combat, who had graduated from the most demanding sniper schools in the world. They did not take kindly to outsiders telling them how to shoot. Master Chief Kowalski stood beside Morrison, his arms crossed and his face showing exactly what he thought of this development. "Commander, this is bullshit. These boys have been shooting since they were kids. They've been through scout sniper school, through advanced urban combat, through every shooting course the military offers. What's some civilian going to teach them that they don't already know?" Before Morrison could answer, the door opened and Michael Gray walked in. He moved quietly, without hurry, but every man in the room noticed him immediately. There was something about the way he carried himself that made experienced operators pay attention. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, "this is Michael Gray. He'll be your marksmanship instructor for the next 6 months." One of the SEALs, Petty Officer Thompson, raised his hand. "Sir, with respect, what are this guy's qualifications? What branch did he serve in?" Morrison looked at Gray, who had remained silent since entering the room. "Mr. Gray, would you like to introduce yourself?" Gray's voice was quiet, almost soft. "Call me Mike. We're going to start with a simple exercise. I want each of you to take your best shot at 1,000 yards. Use whatever rifle you prefer, whatever scope, whatever ammunition you think will work best. Just put your best round downrange." Thompson looked around at his teammates, then back at Gray. "That's not an introduction, man. We asked about your background." "After you shoot," Gray said simply. Master Chief Kowalski stepped forward. "Look, buddy, I don't know who you think you are, but these men are professional warriors. They've been in firefights in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. They've made shots under combat conditions that would make most people piss themselves. They don't need to prove anything to you." Gray nodded slowly. "You're right. They don't need to prove anything to me. I need to prove something to them." 30 minutes later, the entire class was on the 1,000-yard range. The SEALs had set up their rifles with practiced efficiency. Barrett M82s, Remington 700s, custom builds that had been fine-tuned over years of use. Each man knew his weapon intimately, knew exactly how it would behave at different ranges and in different conditions. The targets were standard military silhouettes, black shapes against a tan background. 1,000 yards was a respectable distance, especially with the crosswind that had picked up as the morning progressed. These men could all hit the target reliably at this range. Most could hit the center mass. A few could put rounds in the headshot zone with consistency. Thompson went first. He was a solid shooter, had made confirmed kills at 1,200 yards in Afghanistan. His shot struck the target dead center, exactly where he had aimed. He looked pleased with himself as he worked the bolt and ejected the spent case. One by one, the other SEALs fired. All hits. Several excellent shots that grouped tightly in the center of the target. These were men at the top of their profession, and they showed it. Master Chief Kowalski was the last to shoot. At 52, he was older than the others, but his hands were steady, and his eye was sharp. His round struck the 10 ring, a shot that would have been considered excellent in any company. "Nice shooting," Gray said. "Now it's my turn." He walked to the firing line, carrying what looked like an ancient rifle. The SEALs gathered around, trying to identify the weapon. It was a bolt-action rifle, but the design looked decades old. No fancy scope, no modern accessories, just a simple, worn-looking firearm that belonged in a museum. "What is that thing?" Kowalski asked. "Springfield 1903, Gray replied, settling into position behind the rifle. "Built in 1943. Thompson laughed. "Dude, that's like shooting with a musket. That thing doesn't even have a decent scope." Gray's scope was indeed simple, a basic 4X optic that looked like it had seen better days. No rangefinder, no ballistic computer, none of the modern technology that the SEALs relied on for long-range shooting. "1,000 yards with that antique is going to be interesting," one of the SEALs whispered to his teammate. Gray took his time settling into position. He worked the bolt slowly, chambering around. Through spotting scopes, the SEALs watched him make minute adjustments to his position, shifting slightly left, then right, then settling. The shot surprised everyone. Not because it was loud. The old Springfield was actually quieter than the big magnums the SEALs had been shooting, but because of what happened to the target. Through their spotting scopes, the SEALs watched the target completely disappear. Not hit. Disappear. The shot had struck the target exactly in the center, and the impact had torn the entire silhouette away from its backing. "Holy shit," Thompson breathed. Master Chief Kowalski was studying the target through his scope, trying to understand what he was seeing. That's not possible. At 1,000 yards, with iron sights and an ancient rifle?" Gray worked the bolt and ejected the spent case. "Anyone want to check the target?" 20 minutes later, they were all standing around the target frame. The silhouette was gone, completely shredded by the impact. But more impressive was what they found pinned to the backing board, a playing card. The ace of spades, held in place by the bullet that had passed completely through the center of the target and embedded itself in the wooden frame. "Where did that card come from?" Morrison asked. Gray pulled an identical deck from his pocket. "I placed it behind the target yesterday evening. Figured if I was going to make an impression, I might as well make it memorable. The SEALs were silent, studying the card and the hole through its center. The bullet had passed through the exact center of the ace symbol, a shot that required precision measured in fractions of an inch. "That's a hell of a shot," Kowalski admitted grudgingly. "It's not about the shot," Gray said. "It's about understanding your weapon, understanding your environment, and respecting the fundamentals. You men are excellent shooters, but there are things you can learn." Over the following days, Gray began working with the SEALs individually and in small groups. He never talked about his background, never mentioned military service or previous training. He simply showed them things they had never considered. He taught them to read wind, not just by flags and grass movement, but by watching heat shimmer, observing the way dust moved at different levels, feeling the subtle pressure changes that indicated shifting conditions. He showed them breathing techniques that went far beyond the simple breathe, half-exhale, hold method they had learned. "Your heart rate affects your shooting more than you realize," he explained to Thompson during a one-on-one session. "At 1,000 yards, a pulse rate of 60 beats per minute versus 80 can move your point of impact by several inches. Learn to control not just your breathing, but your entire cardiovascular system." He demonstrated the concept by having Thompson take his pulse, then shoot a group. Then he had him run wind sprints to elevate his heart rate and shoot another group. The difference was dramatic. Shots that had been clustering tightly at the center of the target were now scattered across a much wider area. "Now," Gray said, "let me show you how to bring your heart rate down quickly and maintain steady circulation while maintaining alertness." He taught them a series of mental exercises that seemed almost mystical. Meditation techniques that could slow heart rate and breathing within seconds. Visualization methods that improved accuracy by 10% or more. Mental conditioning exercises that helped maintain focus during long periods of observation. "Shooting is 10% physical technique and 90% mental discipline," he told them. "You can have perfect form, perfect equipment, perfect conditions, but if your mind isn't right, you'll miss." Some of the SEALs were skeptical at first. These were hard men, practical warriors who believed in training that they could understand and quantify. But the results spoke for themselves. Within a week, every man in the class was shooting better than he ever had before. Peterson, who had struggled with shots beyond 800 yards, was now consistently hitting targets at 1,200. Martinez, whose groups had always been good but not exceptional, was now shooting patterns that looked like they had been fired from a machine rest. "How is this possible?" Morrison asked Gray after observing a particularly impressive training session. These men were already among the best shooters in the military. "What are you doing that's different?" Gray was cleaning his old Springfield, running a patch through the barrel with the same methodical care he showed for everything. "I'm not teaching them to shoot, Commander. They already know how to shoot. I'm teaching them to think." "Think about what?" "Everything. The weapon, the ammunition, the environment, the target, themselves. Most shooters learn a technique and stick with it. They become very good at applying that technique under certain conditions, but conditions change, environment changes, targets change, the thinking shooter adapts." Morrison watched Gray reassemble the Springfield with practiced ease. Every movement was economical, purposeful. "That's an unusual rifle for a marksmanship instructor." "It belonged to my grandfather," Gray said quietly. "He carried it in the Pacific during World War II, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima. He taught me to shoot with it when I was 8 years old." "Infantry?" Gray's hands paused for just a moment in their work. "Scout sniper. He had 112 confirmed kills before the war ended." Morrison nodded slowly. That explained some things, but raised many more questions. "And your father?" "Vietnam. Also a sniper." Gray's voice carried a note of finality that suggested the conversation was over, but Morrison was beginning to understand. This wasn't just about shooting. This was about heritage, about knowledge passed down through generations of warriors. Gray wasn't just a civilian contractor. He was the product of a family tradition that stretched back decades. As the days passed, word of the mysterious instructor began to spread throughout the base. Other units asked if they could observe his training sessions. Senior officers who had no business on a shooting range found reasons to stop by and watch Gray work with the SEALs. What they saw was remarkable. Gray never raised his voice, never criticized, never showed frustration with students who struggled to grasp his concepts. He simply observed, adjusted his teaching methods, and found new ways to communicate complex ideas. "The rifle is just a tool," he told the class during a morning session. "Like a hammer or a screwdriver. You wouldn't expect a hammer to build a house by itself, would you? The skill is in the craftsman who wields the tool." He had them practice shooting with different rifles, different scopes, different ammunition. He wanted them to understand that equipment was secondary to fundamental skills. "What happens if your fancy scope breaks in the middle of a mission?" he asked Thompson, who had become particularly fond of a high-end optic system. "What happens if your preferred ammunition isn't available? What happens if you have to use a rifle you've never fired before?" To demonstrate his point, Gray borrowed weapons from the armory, rifles that the SEALs had never used, scopes they weren't familiar with, ammunition they had never tested. Then he proceeded to outshoot all of them with each unfamiliar system. "Adaptation," he explained. "Every rifle has its own personality. Every scope has its own quirks. Every type of ammunition behaves differently. Learn to adapt quickly, and you'll never be helpless." Master Chief Kowalski, who had been the most skeptical of Gray's methods, was becoming one of his strongest supporters. "Commander," he told Morrison privately, "I've been teaching marksmanship for 15 years. I thought I knew everything there was to know about shooting. This guy is showing me things I never even considered." "Such as?" "Yesterday he had us shooting in different lighting conditions. Dawn, midday, dusk, artificial light. Most of us had only really trained for optimal lighting, but he showed us how changes in light affect not just visibility, but bullet trajectory. Heat from sunlight can create updrafts that push bullets high. Artificial light creates shadows that can trick your eye into misreading distances." Morrison was impressed despite himself. These were advanced concepts that even experienced snipers might not consider. "What else?" "He's teaching us to use all our senses, not just sight. To listen to the wind, to feel humidity changes, to smell rain coming that might affect a shot hours later. It sounds crazy, but it works. Yesterday, Rodriguez made a shot at 1,500 yards in conditions that should have been impossible just by using techniques Gray taught him." As Gray's reputation grew, so did the curiosity about his background. The SEALs had begun trying to research him, using every contact and database they could access. But Michael Gray seemed to be a ghost. No military records they could find, no social media presence, no public information of any kind. "It's like he doesn't exist," Thompson told his teammates. "I've got buddies in intelligence, guys who can find out anything about anybody. They come up empty on this guy." "Maybe that's the point," Martinez suggested. "Maybe being invisible is part of what makes him so good." Their speculation was interrupted by a commotion outside the barracks. Through the windows, they could see a convoy of black SUVs pulling up to the base headquarters. Men in expensive suits were getting out, moving with the kind of purpose that suggested official business. "Who do you think that is?" Peterson asked. They had their answer within an hour. The word spread through the base like wildfire. A team from the Department of Defense was conducting an investigation. Something about security breaches, about classified information being compromised. But what really got everyone's attention was the rumor that the investigation was focused on the civilian marksmanship instructor, who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere and had been given unprecedented access to military training facilities. That evening, as Gray packed up his equipment after the day's training, Commander Morrison approached him. The commander's expression was troubled, and he glanced around nervously before speaking. "Mike, we need to talk." Gray looked up from the rifle he was cleaning, his expression unchanged despite the obvious tension in Morrison's voice. "What's on your mind, Commander?" Morrison glanced around the empty range, making sure they were alone. "There's a DOD investigation team on base. They're asking questions about you, about your clearance, your background, your access to classified training methods." "I see." Gray continued working on his rifle, running the cleaning rod through the barrel with methodical precision. "And what are you telling them?" "The truth. That I know nothing about you except that you're the best marksmanship instructor I've ever seen." Morrison paused. "Mike, these guys aren't playing around. They have the authority to shut down this entire program and haul you off in handcuffs if they think you're a security risk." Gray set down the cleaning rod and looked directly at Morrison. "Do you think I'm a security risk, Commander?" Morrison considered the question carefully. Everything about Gray was professional, controlled, clearly the product of extensive training. But there was something else, an aura of danger that Morrison recognized from other special operations veterans, the kind of men who had been to dark places and done necessary things that they never talked about. "No," Morrison said finally, "but I also don't know who you are or where you came from, and that makes me nervous." Gray nodded slowly. "Commander, I understand your position. You have a responsibility to your men and to this facility. If you want me to leave, just say the word." "I don't want you to leave. My SEALs are shooting better than they ever have. They're learning things that are making them more effective operators. But these DOD investigators are going to want answers that I can't provide. Then let me provide them." The next morning, Gray requested a meeting with the investigation team. Morrison was surprised. Most people in Gray's position would have tried to avoid official scrutiny, not seek it out. But Gray seemed completely unconcerned about the investigation. The meeting took place in the base conference room. 3 DOD investigators sat across from Gray and Morrison, their laptops open and recording devices visible on the table. The lead investigator, a woman named Sarah Walsh, had the kind of sharp, analytical demeanor that Morrison associated with federal law enforcement. "Mr. Gray," Walsh began, "we've been reviewing your file, and frankly, there are significant gaps in your background that concern us." "What gaps?" Gray asked calmly. Walsh consulted her notes. "Employment history prior to this assignment, military service records, educational background, social media presence, credit history. There's virtually no digital footprint for someone named Michael Gray matching your description. Perhaps you're looking in the wrong places." "We've looked everywhere, Mr. Gray. Our analysts are very thorough." Walsh leaned forward slightly. "It's almost as if Michael Gray didn't exist before you showed up here 3 weeks ago." Gray was quiet for a long moment, studying the investigators with the same calm attention he gave to everything else. Morrison could feel the tension in the room building. "Ms. Walsh," Gray said finally, "what would you like to know?" "Let's start with your military service. What branch? What years? What unit?" "I never said I had military service." "No, but you clearly have advanced training. The marksmanship skills you've demonstrated, the tactical knowledge you possess, the clearance levels you've been granted. These suggest extensive military or intelligence background." "Or civilian training," Gray suggested mildly. Walsh's frustration was becoming visible. "Mr. Gray, you're being deliberately evasive. We have a job to do here. We need to verify that you aren't a security risk to this facility or to the personnel training here." "Then verify it." "How can we verify anything if you won't provide basic biographical information?" Gray reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single business card. He placed it on the table and slid it across to Walsh. "Call that number. Ask for Admiral Richardson. Tell him you're investigating Michael Gray." Walsh picked up the card and studied it. Morrison couldn't see what was written on it, but the effect on the investigators was immediate. Walsh's expression changed from frustration to something approaching shock. "This is a Pentagon number," she said quietly. "Yes." Walsh excused herself and left the room to make the phone call. Her colleagues remained, but they seemed less aggressive now, unsure how to proceed. Gray sat patiently, apparently content to wait as long as necessary. 15 minutes later, Walsh returned. Her entire demeanor had changed. Where she had been suspicious and confrontational before, she now seemed almost respectful. "Mr. Gray," she said carefully, "Admiral Richardson sends his regards. He also said to tell you that your operational security has been, quote, textbook perfect as always." "Good to hear." He also said that any further questions about your background should be directed to him personally. Walsh was clearly struggling with this development. He emphasized that you have his complete confidence and the full support of Naval Special Warfare Command. "Is there anything else?" Gray asked. Walsh looked at her colleagues, who shook their heads slightly. "No, sir. I believe our investigation is complete." After the investigators left, Morrison sat across from Gray in the empty conference room. "Well, that was interesting." "Was it?" "Mike, who the hell are you?" Gray smiled for the first time since Morrison had known him. "I'm exactly who I said I was. A marksmanship instructor." "And Admiral Richardson?" "Is an old friend." Morrison realized he wasn't going to get more information than that. But the intervention by a Pentagon admiral suggested that Gray was connected at the highest levels of the military hierarchy. It also raised new questions about what Gray was really doing at the training center. That afternoon, Gray announced that he was going to demonstrate an advanced training scenario for the SEAL class. They would be conducting a simulated hostage rescue operation, with Gray playing the role of an opposing sniper. "The scenario is simple," he explained to the assembled SEALs. "There are 3 hostages in Building C. Your job is to neutralize the threat and secure the hostages. My job is to prevent you from completing the mission." Master Chief Kowalski raised his hand. "What rules of engagement?" "Paintball rounds only. If you get hit in the head or chest, you're dead and out of the exercise. If I get hit anywhere, the threat is neutralized and you win." Thompson looked skeptical. "It's 12 of us against 1 of you, with paintball guns. How is that even fair?" "Fair isn't the point," Gray replied. "Realistic is the point. In the real world, you might face a single sniper who has every advantage. Better position, better knowledge of the terrain, the initiative. Your job is to overcome those disadvantages through teamwork, tactics, and superior execution." The exercise area was a mock urban environment that the SEALs used for close-quarters battle training. 3 buildings arranged around a central courtyard with multiple windows, doorways, and firing positions. Gray was given 30 minutes to position himself anywhere in the area, while the SEALs planned their approach. Morrison and several other officers gathered in the observation tower to watch the exercise. They could see Gray moving through the buildings, studying angles and fields of fire. He moved like a ghost, quiet and purposeful, seeming to disappear into the shadows. "Where did he go?" Lieutenant Colonel Chen asked, scanning the area with binoculars. Morrison was trying to track Gray's movement, but had lost sight of him minutes earlier. "He's in there somewhere, but damned if I can see where." The SEALs began their approach in 2 teams. 6 men would assault the building containing the hostages, while the other 6 would provide overwatch and suppressive fire. It was a textbook approach. The kind of operation these men had executed dozens of times in training and combat. They moved with practiced precision, using cover and concealment, communicating through hand signals and whispered radio transmissions. Morrison felt a surge of pride watching them work. These were professionals at the top of their game. The first shot came when the assault team was 50 meters from the target building. Thompson, who was leading the advance, suddenly sprouted a bright red paintball mark in the center of his chest. He raised his hand and stepped back, dead according to the rules of the exercise. "Where did that come from?" Kowalski demanded over the radio. The Overwatch team scanned every visible position with their scopes, looking for any sign of Gray. Nothing. No muzzle flash, no movement, no indication of where the shot had originated. "Ghost team, do you have eyes on the shooter?" the assault team leader asked. "Negative. No visual on target." The assault team regrouped and continued forward, now more cautious. They moved in bounds, with half the team providing cover while the others advanced. It was slower, but safer. The second shot dropped Martinez from the Overwatch team. He was in a concealed position 200 meters away, behind cover that should have made him invisible. But somehow Gray had found him and made a perfect shot. "This is impossible," Peterson muttered. "He's hitting us from positions we can't even see." Morrison was watching through binoculars, trying to understand what he was seeing. Gray seemed to be shooting from multiple locations, but that was impossible. He was just one man with one rifle. "There," Chen pointed to a third-story window. "I saw movement." The Overwatch team immediately focused their attention on the window, but it was empty. No sign that anyone had ever been there. The third shot took out Rodriguez, the team's designated marksman. He had been in an excellent position with clear lines of sight in multiple directions, but Gray had found an angle that Rodriguez hadn't considered and made another perfect shot. "Son of a bitch is picking us off one by one," Kowalski said grimly. The exercise continued for another 20 minutes, with Gray steadily eliminating the SEALs one by one. Each shot was perfectly placed, and each came from a position that seemed impossible. By the time it was over, Gray had eliminated 10 of the 12 SEALs without taking a single return shot. The two survivors, Kowalski and Peterson, had managed to complete the mission by reaching the hostages, but the cost had been devastating, an 83% casualty rate against a single opponent. During the after-action review, the SEALs gathered around Gray, eager to understand how he had accomplished what seemed impossible. "First question," Thompson said. "How were you shooting from so many different positions? It was like you were 3 different people." Gray smiled slightly. "I wasn't shooting from multiple positions. I was shooting from one position that gave me multiple angles." "That doesn't make sense." "Show me your assault route," Gray said, pointing to a map of the exercise area. Thompson traced the path his team had taken, pointing out the cover positions they had used. Gray nodded, then marked a single spot on the map. "I was here the entire time," he said, pointing to what looked like an empty area between buildings. Underground maintenance tunnel with firing ports that the engineers built into the design but never marked on the maps. The SEALs stared at the map in surprise. None of them had known about the tunnel. "How did you know about it?" Kowalski asked. "I studied the architectural plans before the exercise. Original blueprints from when this facility was built. Most people only look at the current maps, but the original plans often show features that have been forgotten over time." Morrison was impressed despite himself. Gray had done his homework in a way that went far beyond normal preparation. "Second question," Martinez said. "How were you hitting us at ranges where we couldn't even see you?" "You were looking for me in the wrong places," Gray explained. "You assumed I would be in elevated positions with good fields of view. But sometimes the best shooting position is the one nobody expects." He led them to the position he had actually used, a narrow gap between 2 buildings at ground level. It was barely wide enough for a person to fit through and offered limited fields of fire. But from that position, Gray had been able to see small portions of every approach route. "The key is understanding geometry," he explained. "You don't need to see the entire target, just the vital area you need to hit. A few inches of exposure is enough if you know exactly where to look." Peterson shook his head. "But the angles... Some of those shots seemed impossible from this position." "Nothing is impossible if you understand ballistics well enough." Gray picked up his rifle and demonstrated the angles he had used, showing how he could reach targets that seemed to be completely hidden behind cover. The demonstration was extraordinary. Gray was using ricochets, deflection shots, and angles that defied conventional wisdom about marksmanship. He was making the rifle do things that shouldn't have been possible. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Kowalski asked, genuine awe in his voice. Gray's expression became distant, almost sad. "From people who didn't have the luxury of conventional shooting positions. People who had to make impossible shots because their lives and the lives of their teammates depended on it." There was something in his voice that suggested painful memories, experiences that went far beyond normal military training. Morrison realized that they were seeing only a fraction of Gray's capabilities, and that there were depths to this man that they couldn't begin to imagine. Over the following days, Gray introduced more advanced scenarios that pushed the SEALs to their limits. Night shooting exercises using minimal artificial lighting, moving target scenarios where the targets were small, fast, and unpredictable. Environmental challenges that required shooting in rain, wind, and extreme temperature variations. Each exercise revealed new aspects of Gray's expertise. He seemed to have unlimited knowledge of advanced marksmanship techniques, from the physics of bullet flight to the psychology of combat shooting. But more than that, he understood how to teach complex concepts in ways that practical operators could grasp and apply. "The difference between a good shooter and a great shooter isn't equipment or talent," he told the class during one evening session. "It's the ability to adapt to circumstances you never trained for, using principles that apply in any situation." He demonstrated the concept by having the SEALs attempt shots with unfamiliar weapons, in poor lighting, with time pressure that simulated combat conditions. Then he showed them how to break down any shooting problem into fundamental elements that could be solved with basic principles. "Physics doesn't change," he explained. "Gravity always pulls down, wind always affects bullet flight, distance always requires elevation adjustment. If you understand the principles, you can adapt to any scenario." The SEALs were learning more than marksmanship. They were learning to think like scientists and engineers, to analyze problems systematically and find solutions based on fundamental laws rather than rote memorization. But perhaps most importantly, they were learning confidence. The knowledge that they could succeed even in impossible circumstances, that they possessed skills and understanding that went far beyond standard military training. "He's not just making us better shooters," Thompson told Morrison after a particularly challenging exercise. "He's making us better operators, more confident, more adaptable, better at solving problems under pressure." Morrison had been thinking the same thing. Gray's influence went far beyond marksmanship instruction. He was teaching the SEALs to think differently about their capabilities, to approach challenges with a level of confidence and creativity that was transforming them as warriors. But questions about Gray's background remained. Despite the endorsement from Admiral Richardson, Morrison sensed that there were secrets that ran much deeper than anyone realized. The skills Gray demonstrated, the knowledge he possessed, the way he moved and thought, all suggested experiences that went far beyond conventional military training. Late one evening, as Gray was packing up after another successful training session, Morrison made one more attempt to learn something about the man who had appeared so mysteriously in their midst. "Mike, can I ask you something personal?" Gray looked up from the rifle case he was organizing. "You can ask. You've got skills that I've never seen before. Knowledge that seems to go beyond anything taught in military schools. You move like special operations, think like intelligence, shoot like... Hell, I don't know what you shoot like, but it's not anything I've encountered in 28 years of service." Gray continued packing his equipment, neither confirming nor denying Morrison's observations. "My question is simple," Morrison continued. "Are you here just to teach marksmanship, or is there something else going on?" Gray closed the rifle case and looked directly at Morrison. "Commander, sometimes the most important missions are the ones nobody knows about. Sometimes the best way to serve your country is to be invisible, to work without recognition or acknowledgement." And sometimes the most valuable training happens when people don't realize they're being trained for something bigger than they understand. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in Gray's tone that suggested preparations for events that hadn't happened yet, training for scenarios that couldn't be discussed openly. "What aren't you telling me, Mike?" Gray shouldered his rifle case and started walking toward the exit. At the door, he paused and looked back. "Commander, the world is changing. The threats we'll face in the next decade are going to require operators with capabilities that go far beyond current training standards. Your men are learning skills they don't even realize they're acquiring, skills that may save their lives and the lives of countless others when the time comes." When what time comes? But Gray was already gone, disappearing into the darkness outside the training facility, like a ghost returning to whatever shadows had produced him. The emergency klaxon shattered the pre-dawn quiet of Naval Special Warfare Training Center Coronado. Morrison was out of bed and dressed within 2 minutes, muscle memory from decades of military service taking over before his conscious mind fully processed what was happening. The alert came over his secure phone as he ran toward the command center. A terrorist cell had taken hostages at a federal building in downtown San Diego. Local law enforcement was overwhelmed. The FBI's hostage rescue team was 3 hours away. Naval Special Warfare Command was being asked to provide immediate tactical support. Morrison reached the command center to find organized chaos. Communications personnel were coordinating with multiple agencies, intelligence officers were gathering information about the threat, and his SEAL teams were already gearing up for potential deployment. "What do we know?" Morrison asked his operations officer. "At least 6 armed terrorists, possibly more. They've taken approximately 20 hostages in a federal courthouse. Unknown demands, unknown timeline. Local SWAT has the building surrounded, but they're outgunned and requesting support." Morrison studied the tactical display showing the courthouse layout. It was a complex target, multiple floors, numerous rooms, limited access points, the kind of operation that required precision and expertise beyond normal SWAT capabilities. "What about our advanced training class?" Morrison asked. "Are they ready for real-world deployment?" "Sir, they're not technically operational. They're still in training status." Morrison knew that was true officially, but after weeks of Gray's instruction, his SEALs were performing at levels he had never seen before. "Get them suited up anyway. We might need every operator we can get." 20 minutes later, Morrison was briefing his teams when Gray appeared in the command center. He wasn't supposed to be there. Civilian contractors had no role in operational planning, but somehow he had gained access to one of the most secure areas of the base. "Mr. Gray, you need to leave," Morrison said. "This is a restricted operational briefing." Gray ignored the dismissal and studied the tactical displays. His eyes moved systematically across the building layout, the surveillance photos, the intelligence reports. Morrison could see him processing information with the kind of rapid analysis that suggested extensive operational experience. "Commander," Gray said quietly, "you're going to lose people if you assault that building." "That's not your concern." "Actually, it is." Gray pulled out his phone and made a brief call. Morrison couldn't hear the conversation, but within minutes, Morrison's secure line was ringing. It was Admiral Richardson. "Commander Morrison, you are to provide Michael Gray with complete operational briefing and include him in all tactical planning." "That is a direct order." Morrison stared at Gray with new understanding. "Yes, sir." Gray studied the building schematics with the intensity of someone who had done this type of analysis many times before. "How many snipers do you have available?" 3 qualified long-range marksmen, including Master Chief Kowalski." "That's not enough. This building has 17 windows with potential firing positions. 6 known terrorists could cover all your approach routes if they're positioned correctly." Gray traced sight lines on the building diagram. "You need overwatch positions here, here, and here to provide coverage, and you need someone who can make shots that your snipers aren't trained for. Morrison was beginning to understand. You want to deploy as part of the operation? I'm offering. Mr. Gray, with all due respect, this isn't a training exercise. These are real bullets, real terrorists, real hostages. One mistake costs lives. Gray's expression was calm, almost peaceful. Commander, I've never missed when lives depended on it. There was something in his voice that convinced Morrison instantly. This was a man who had been in situations like this before, who understood the weight of real-world operations. Morrison made a decision that went against regulations, but felt absolutely right. What do you need? 30 minutes later, Gray was positioned on a rooftop 800 meters from the federal courthouse. He had his old Springfield rifle, a radio for communication with the assault teams, and a clear view of the target building. Morrison was still amazed that Gray had chosen his antique rifle over modern sniper systems, but after weeks of watching him perform impossible feats, Morrison trusted his judgment completely. The SEAL teams were in position around the building, waiting for the signal to begin the assault. Intelligence had identified 6 terrorists holding hostages on the 3rd floor. Local SWAT had attempted negotiation, but the terrorists weren't responding to communication attempts. Ghost 6, this is Overwatch. Gray's voice came through Morrison's headset. I have visual on 3 targets in 3rd floor windows. They're armed with automatic weapons and positioned to cover all ground floor entrances. Morrison studied his tactical display. Can you engage? Affirmative, but I need the assault teams in position. Once I start shooting, you'll have maybe 30 seconds before they realize what's happening and start executing hostages. Morrison coordinated with his team leaders, making sure everyone was ready for immediate assault. The plan was ambitious. Simultaneous breaches at 3 different points, with Gray providing overwatch to eliminate the window positions before they could fire on the assault teams. All teams report ready, Morrison announced. Overwatch ready, Gray replied, engaging in 3, 2, 1. The first shot was fired before Morrison heard the radio call. Through binoculars, he saw one of the terrorists in the east window simply drop from sight. No drama, no extended death scene. One moment he was there, the next he was gone. The second shot came 2 seconds later, another terrorist eliminated with surgical precision. Gray was working the bolt of his old rifle with practiced speed, but Morrison could barely detect the movement through his optics. The third shot took out the terrorist in the west window before he could even react to his partner's deaths. 3 targets neutralized in less than 6 seconds from 800 meters away, with what looked like perfect accuracy. Targets eliminated, Gray announced calmly. Assault teams are clear to breach. The SEAL teams moved like clockwork, breaching the building simultaneously and clearing rooms with the efficiency that came from years of training and weeks of Gray's advanced instruction. Morrison listened to their radio reports as they systematically cleared each floor, securing hostages and hunting for remaining terrorists. 2nd floor clear. 3rd floor, we have hostages. All appear alive and unharmed. 4th floor, 2 more tangos down. 5th floor, 1 tango alive, attempting surrender. Morrison felt a surge of pride as his teams executed a perfect operation. No casualties among the SEALs, no hostages harmed, all terrorists either dead or in custody. But what impressed him most was Gray's shooting. 3 perfect shots at extended range, under pressure, with lives hanging in the balance. Each shot had been precisely placed to instantly neutralize the threat without risking collateral damage. Overwatch, this is command. Outstanding work. Just doing my job, Gray replied. 4 hours later, after the hostages had been evacuated and the scene secured, Morrison found Gray packing his rifle on the rooftop where he had been positioned. The old Springfield looked as worn and ordinary as ever, but Morrison now understood that he was looking at a weapon that had just helped save 20 lives. Mike, I need to know who you really are." Gray continued cleaning his rifle with the same methodical care he always showed. "You know who I am, Commander." "No, I don't. I know you're the best marksmanship instructor I've ever seen. I know you have connections at the Pentagon that allow you to override my operational security. I know you just made 3 impossible shots that saved lives and made my teams look like heroes. But I don't know who Michael Gray really is." Gray was quiet for a long time, running a cleaning patch through the barrel of his rifle. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that suggested old pain and hard-won experience. "My real name isn't Michael Gray. That's just the identity I use for this type of assignment." Morrison waited, sensing that he was finally going to get the truth. "My father was Staff Sergeant William Hayes, 1st Marine Division, Vietnam. Scout sniper with over 200 confirmed kills. He died in 1971 when I was 5 years old." Gray's voice was steady but distant. "My grandfather was Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Hayes, 2nd Marine Division, World War II. Scout sniper in the Pacific Theater with 112 confirmed kills. And you?" "Gunnery Sergeant Michael Hayes, United States Marine Corps, retired. Scout sniper, force reconnaissance, then other assignments that don't appear in official records." Gray looked up at Morrison. "Confirmed kills. Well, let's just say I've carried on the family tradition." Morrison felt pieces falling into place. "How many years?" 26 years active duty. Iraq, Afghanistan, and places that don't officially exist. Then 8 years of contracts that never happened for agencies that don't exist." Jesus Christ. Morrison was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he was dealing with. "You're a legend. I've heard stories about a Marine sniper who could make impossible shots, who worked alone behind enemy lines, who had more confirmed kills than any operator in modern history. They called him the Phantom." Gray smiled slightly. "Names are just sounds people make with their mouths, Commander." "But why? Why are you here teaching basic marksmanship to SEALs when you could be doing anything?" Gray stood up and shouldered his rifle case. "Because the world is changing, Commander. The threats we're going to face in the next decade are unlike anything we've encountered before. Traditional military training isn't going to be enough. Your SEALs need to think differently, adapt faster, perform at levels that go beyond standard doctrine. So, you're here to prepare them. I'm here to plant seeds, to teach them concepts and skills that they'll need when the time comes, even if they don't understand why yet." Gray paused. "The operation today was a test. Your men performed flawlessly because they've internalized principles I've been teaching them for weeks. They adapted to circumstances they'd never trained for, using fundamental skills that apply to any situation." Morrison realized that every training exercise, every seemingly academic lesson about ballistics and environmental factors, every advanced scenario Gray had designed had been preparing his SEALs for real-world situations they couldn't have imagined. "How many other training centers have you visited?" "Enough. Special Forces, Rangers, Delta, SEALs, CIA contractors, anyone who might face situations where conventional training isn't sufficient." Morrison understood now why Gray had seemed like a ghost. He was a ghost, a legendary operator who moved between assignments under different identities, always training, always preparing others for challenges they couldn't yet see. The next morning, word of the successful hostage rescue had spread throughout the base. The FBI was crediting the Navy SEALs with a textbook operation that had saved 20 lives without a single casualty. The media was reporting it as a triumph of American special operations capabilities. But among the SEALs who had participated, the real story was different. They knew that their success had been possible because of skills learned from a civilian contractor who had appeared mysteriously and transformed their capabilities in just a few weeks. Master Chief Kowalski found Gray in the equipment shed, organizing his gear for departure. "Sir, the men want to know if you're leaving." "My assignment here is complete." Sir, with respect, we've learned more from you in 6 weeks than in years of previous training. You've made us better operators, better teammates, better warriors. We're hoping you might consider staying longer." Gray looked at the grizzled Master Chief, seeing in him the kind of career professional who formed the backbone of American Special Operations. "Chief, you don't need me anymore. You have everything I can teach you. Trust your training, trust your teammates, and trust yourselves to adapt to whatever challenges you face." Word spread quickly that Gray was leaving. Within an hour, something unprecedented happened at Naval Special Warfare Training Center Coronado. Every SEAL on the base, from the newest trainees to the most senior operators, assembled in formation on the main parade ground. As Gray walked toward the parking area carrying his single rifle case, 200 Navy SEALs stood at attention. Without any command or coordination, they began saluting, not the crisp, formal salute required by regulation, but the slower, more respectful salute reserved for honoring the fallen or acknowledging extraordinary service. Morrison stood with his men, his own hand raised in salute, finally understanding what he was witnessing. This was how warriors acknowledged a legend, not because of rank or title, but because of demonstrated excellence and proven dedication to the mission. Gray stopped walking and stood silently for a long moment, looking at the assembled SEALs. Then he shifted his rifle case to his left hand and returned their salute with the kind of precision that spoke of decades of military service. When he lowered his hand, Gray spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Gentlemen, it has been an honor to serve with you. Use what you've learned. Trust each other. Never quit." He turned and walked to his truck, loaded his equipment, and drove away without looking back. Most of the SEALs would never see him again, but they would never forget the lessons he had taught them or the way he had expanded their understanding of what was possible. Morrison watched the truck disappear through the base gates, then turned to address his men. "All right, everyone back to work. We've got training to complete and standards to maintain." But as the SEALs dispersed, Morrison heard fragments of conversation that told him Gray's legacy would endure. "Did you see those shots he made yesterday? 800 meters, 3 targets, 6 seconds. My groupings have improved by 50% since he started working with us. He taught me to see wind patterns I never knew existed. The breathing techniques he showed us, it's like meditation, but for warriors." 6 months later, Morrison received a classified after-action report about a counterterrorism operation in Eastern Europe. A small team of special operations personnel had successfully eliminated a high-value target under impossible conditions, making shots that defied conventional wisdom about the limits of marksmanship. The operation was officially credited to NATO Special Forces, but Morrison recognized the signature: precision shooting at extreme range under adverse conditions with no margin for error. Somewhere in the report's technical analysis of the shooting positions and ballistic calculations, Morrison could see the influence of lessons that a mysterious instructor had taught to a group of Navy SEALs. Morrison kept Gray's business card in his desk drawer, though he had never used the number. Sometimes he wondered what other training centers Gray was visiting, what other operators he was preparing for challenges they couldn't yet imagine. But mostly, Morrison focused on his own responsibilities, training the next generation of SEALs using the expanded understanding that Gray had provided. The lessons about adaptation, about thinking beyond conventional limits, about the mental discipline required for impossible shots, had become part of the permanent curriculum. The official record would never show that Michael Gray had visited Naval Special Warfare Training Center Coronado. There were no photographs, no documentation, no evidence that he had ever been there. But his influence lived on in every SEAL who had learned to think like him, to shoot like him, to approach impossible challenges with the kind of confidence that came from truly understanding their craft. Years later, when those SEALs faced situations that required skills beyond their original training, they would remember the quiet civilian who had taught them that excellence wasn't about equipment or rank or official recognition. Excellence was about dedication to the mission, respect for the fundamentals, and the humility to keep learning from anyone who had something valuable to teach. In the Brotherhood of Special Operations, stories are passed down through generations of warriors. Stories about legendary operators who achieved impossible things, who inspired others to exceed their own limitations, who served without recognition or reward because the mission was more important than personal glory. The story of the Phantom Marksman became one of those legends, a reminder that the most important training often comes from the most unexpected sources, and that true excellence reveals itself not through titles or ceremonies, but through quiet competence and unwavering dedication to making others better than they thought they could be. No rank, no identity. Yet every SEAL saluted, because they recognized something more important than military hierarchy. They recognized a master of their craft who had used his skills not for personal glory, but to ensure that future generations of warriors would be ready for whatever challenges awaited them in an uncertain world. In the end, that was Michael Gray's true identity, not a name or a rank or an official position, but a commitment to excellence that inspired others to reach beyond their perceived limitations and become the warriors their country needed them to be.